Good morning, everybody. Can you believe that it is already 2024 and we are quickly approaching the start of a new gardening season here in the Midwest? For those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. I'm gardening in Midwestern Ohio in Zone 6A. And for those of you who have been with me for a while, thank you for sticking with me through this couple of months hiatus. I am busily working on getting new gardening content ready for the coming gardening season. Now, before we jump into the favorites, I wanted to cover just a few things, and these are the same things that I mentioned in last year's video. The first is that I am a seed trial manager by trade. So every season I trial hundreds of varieties, some new, some old. Some of them are coming directly from breeding companies and seed companies. So not all of these are on the market yet. For the items where I know of a source, I try to list it in the video, but if they aren't for sale yet, I do look for them to come to the market very soon. Keep in mind too that these are my favorites just from the 2023 gardening season. I've been trialing and keeping track of favorites since about 2012. So if you're looking for a specific class of vegetable and you don't see it listed here, feel free to drop a line in the comments below and ask me about it. Chances are I have a variety or 10 I can recommend. Be sure to also check out the favorites from 2022 and 21 videos, and I will link those in this video description below. And I'm currently working on compiling a complete list that I hope to have up on my website relatively soon. And one last note, for the most part, varieties tend to be regionally adapted. That means that a tomato that does awesome in Ohio may not perform so well in Southern California. We have very different growing conditions, different pest pressures, different disease pressures, and that all equates to things doing well in certain areas and not so well in others. Now, 2023 was a challenging growing year here in Ohio with a lot of temperature swings from hot to cold and back again. We had drought in the later part of the summer into early fall. So I don't have as many varieties that performed exceptionally this year as I have in prior years, but those that did perform well, you can bet those are very strong varieties. So let's jump into the favorites. Kicking off this year with a broccoli, and this is Purple Magic Hybrid Broccoli. This is a brand new All-American Selections winner, and this is the first purple heading, purple stemmed broccoli. This is one because this is a brand new release. At the time of filming this video, I couldn't find any seed companies that had this one for sale, but I do look for it to be out there very, very soon. Purple Magic is higher in anthocyanin, an antioxidant, which gives it its purple color, and it has a sweeter flavor than most of your typical green heading broccolis. But what really stood out to me with this one during a terrible growing season was that it was extremely vigorous and seemed to resist stress very, very well. So we had an early, very hot, very dry spell, and a lot of my comparison broccolis basically just went straight to bolting. So they were starting to form a head, it got hot, and they immediately started sending up flower stalks. Purple Magic did not. It seemed to tolerate the heat and those temperature swings really, really well. It formed nice big heads. It didn't get bitter. It didn't button or bolt. So for me, growing in an area that has unpredictable spring seasons, a broccoli like this is a garden lifesaver. Now, you may have heard me mention one of my other favorite purple broccolis in the past, and that is burgundy sprouting broccoli. The difference there is the Purple Magic is a standard heading broccoli. So one big head harvested, you will get some side shoots, but it's not going to be a prolonged harvest like the sprouting type will be. But in my garden, I can definitely see a place for both of them. The Purple Magic for a nice big initial harvest, and then that burgundy sprouting broccoli for an extended harvest of those smaller shoots and florets. Next up is Slaw Master Cabbage. I've been on the lookout for a full size, so around that 8 to 10 pound head size, multi-purpose cabbage for a while now. My wish list included excellent tolerance to heat and cold and swings between those extremes, relatively early maturity, good performance in both the spring and the fall growing seasons, good holding ability without cracking, so it gives me a longer harvest window, a tight core, and great flavor. Basically, a great tasting cabbage that's foolproof to grow. I felt like that was reasonable expectation. Well, Slaw Master did tick all of those boxes for me. Cabbage is Not necessarily the most glamorous vegetable in the garden, but it is a vegetable that is a standby in my garden. So it's really nice to have a variety that's easy to grow, stress resistant, reliably produces nice big heads. I did find that the heads stored well in cold storage. They also make an excellent fermented curtido. Now, I love, love, love bunching onions, also known as scallions. I find that they're easier to grow than bulbing onions. They tend to be extremely winter hardy, and they're just really versatile in cooking. My old standby is a variety called Guardsman, which is still an excellent option. But when I saw a new variety called Nebuchon, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, in Johnny's catalog, it sucked me in. The claim of a sweeter, more complex flavor than standard bunching onions is what really got me. And it did deliver on that claim. I found it to be sweeter, a little milder than some bunching onions, and it did have this kind of savory complexity to the flavor. Now, according to Johnny's, this one can be grown as a special style of Japanese leek if you hill the shanks. I did not do this, but you can see that these formed a pretty sizable shank without doing anything extra. Now, these have been in my garden since early spring, and it remains to be seen how cold hardy this variety is. My Guardsman, I can typically overwinter here with no protection. I'll know on this one come about March, but you can see it's got these nice big greens on here. This thing has still been productive up until the beginning of January. So I'm really impressed with it. Another vegetable I am always on the lookout for are carrots that can tolerate my heavy soil. This year's winner was Crunch-a-Bunch carrot, and its thicker Nant-style root powers down through heavy soil a lot better than something like, say, an Imperator type, which tends to be really thin and delicate. It reliably produces at least 6-inch long, deep orange roots. And one of the best parts for me was that, again, in a spring season where it got unseasonably hot and dry, and a lot of my other standby carrots really kind of got bitter in the heat, this one stayed nice and sweet and mild and had an exceptionally crisp crunch. Another standby spring root crop are beets, and I have a long-standing love affair with beets, but they are not always the easiest thing to grow here in Ohio. One of the keys to success for me, besides healthy soil and proper timing, are finding varieties that form nice, strong, deep tap roots and have great stress resistance. And such was the case with this new variety, Unbeatable. I found this one quite easy to grow. It has relatively early maturity, which means I'm getting a harvest before the weather gets really hot and dry. Great stress resistance, thanks in part to a nice root system and a nice deep taproot. The roots can reach a large size without getting woody. So I was regularly harvesting beet roots about this big, and they were still nice and tender, but you can harvest this one anytime from baby size on up. It has nice, big, strong tops. And those beet greens are great for eating too. I like to prepare them much in the same way I would prepare chard. And the beets themselves have great flavor. So really sweet, rich, and with a minimal amount of earthy flavor. And I do like that earthy flavor in a beet. I know there are some people who don't, but for me, that's what makes a beet a beet. Now, are there sweeter, more refined varieties on the market? Yes. And to fill that niche, I highly recommend varieties like Red Cloud or maybe Bohan. But Unbeatable for me really is the best all-around performer. So good flavor combined with ease of growth compared with good health and size. It just, again, ticks all those boxes off for a great garden variety. Next up, a couple of really nice shell beans. So I don't actually eat that many beans, but I grow them every year in the garden because I am absolutely enamored with all of the shapes and colors and patterns that are available in shell beans. Now, the first winner this year is a variety called Nightfall. And the picture in the catalog got me instantly. It's a really attractive, unique bean. But then the fun story of how it ended up in fruition seeds lineup really sealed the deal for me. I love a seed with a good story, and it didn't disappoint. It was lovely, easy to grow, productive. I really liked the semi-pole habit, so these grew to about 4 feet, so it was easy to trellis them on my shorter pea fences rather than having to have a great big tall elaborate trellis for them. Easy to pick. And the beans themselves are similar in size and eating quality to your typical black bean. So I use these much in the same way that I would use a standard black bean. The other thing I noticed was it seemed like these were easier to shell than some of my other shell bean varieties. Now the second variety is one that I've actually grown off and on in my garden for about a decade now. I just keep coming back to it because it's such a good bean. And this is Tiger's Eye shell bean. And this one is a big, meaty bean with a really nice, rich flavor. And this one I use in a manner similar to how I would use pinto beans. So for a really good, basic, and versatile recipe, I've linked a recipe from Radical Family Farms for Tiger's Eye beans in the video description below. The other nice thing is it does have really tender skins. A lot of seed companies say the skins disappear upon cooking. I don't know if that's entirely accurate, but they are really thin and delicate and you don't even really notice them when you're eating them. Now this one is a bush shell bean, so more of about that 2.5 foot size. It does have a tendency to throw some vines. So typically when you have your plot in the garden, you'll notice several plants will send up vines or shoots that are several feet higher. Not a big deal. You can either plant this variety along a short support or just let those vines kind of sprawl and intermix with the other plants. Very, very productive, reliably produces big beans, just a really nice variety overall. Next on to green or snap beans. Now, green beans are relatively easy to grow here in Ohio, and it takes quite a bit anymore to get me excited about a new green bean variety, but this one did it. This one is Blue Lake Superior. And you may be familiar with Blue Lake beans, but you may not realize that Blue Lake is a class of beans, not an actual variety. So the one that most people are familiar with, the one I see offered in seed catalogs a lot, is Blue Lake 274. That's an old variety. But the Blue Lake class is typically going to have, most remarkably, that flavor. So what most people kind of describe as that good old-fashioned green bean flavor, they're known for that. They also tend to have longer, thinner pods. They are stringless, productive, overall reliable performance in the home garden. Well, this new Blue Lake Superior keeps on those family traditions, especially flavor. It has a great flavor, cooked, fresh, frozen, or canned. But some of the improvements include a more upright plant structure. So your plants aren't going to get all floppy. They stand up better. They stand up better after you've gone through and picked them. I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I find that a lot of times I'll go in and do my first thorough picking and I come back and all my bean plants are like, they're still productive, but they kind of look like crud and they're harder to pick for the next picking. This one has a more upright structure, so the plants stay upright, easier picking, keeps the pods off the ground. The pods are also more uniform and straight. Again, nice for picking, also nice if you do something like a canned dilly bean, where it's easier if all those pods are kind of the same size and shape. It's got better disease resistance than the older varieties, so overall you're going to see healthier plants in your garden. And the thing that blew me away was the production. Blue Lake Superior more than doubled production on my comparison varieties this year. And most beans in general are pretty productive to start with. So I had a lot of green beans. The other thing that I noticed with that production was it tended to come in waves. So I would have a huge picking, strip all those beans, get them cleaned off, and almost reliably, like 2 weeks later, I'd have another huge picking, rather than the beans kind of putting on a handful here and a handful there. And this was really nice for processing. So if I just wanted to get a bunch of beans and I wanted to get them all canned or frozen, I could go out and pick and do a huge batch, rather than having to pick, save them in the refrigerator, pick some more. Not an issue for those of you who are planting like acres of beans, but if you're only doing a relatively small planting, this is a really nice trait. This is one that I'm going to be growing in my own garden from here on out. It surpassed my old favorite, which was Derby, and next year I'm already looking forward to doing a larger planting of this Blue Lake Superior variety. Next up, cucumber. But this is not just any run-of-the-mill garden variety cucumber. I actually consider this one a bit of a frivolous treat on my part, but it was so fun to grow. Quick Snack Cucumber is in a line of what I would consider micro-dwarf vegetable plants, the line being called Kitchen Minis. And the idea with these is that they can be grown in small pots. So for this one, they recommend a 6 to 8 inch size pot, either on a windowsill or like I did under grow lights. I've grown other veggies in this Kitchen Minis series. I've had great success with a lot of their tomatoes and their peppers. The cucumber did not disappoint. Now, I like to grow these micro-dwarf veggies indoors in the winter, and I do mine under grow lights because I just don't get enough reliable sunlight through my windows in the wintertime, but they do really, really well under grow lights. A quick snack is a parthenocarpic variety, so it does not require pollination to set fruit, and it sets little, what they call cocktail-sized cucumbers. So I was picking at about 4 inches, and they are sweet, tender, and crisp with a very, very thin skin. My kids loved these. In fact, my biggest issue with the quick snack cucumber was that my kids were fighting over who got the last cucumber. Because as you can imagine, I was not getting a ton of production off of these things. But again, a lot of fun to grow. Now, what would the garden favorites be without at least one hot pepper? This is another group of veggies where I probably only really need one plant ever of hot peppers, but I love them so much that I go overboard every year. Now, this year's big winner is a variety called Ají de Colorado Alpino, and it is actually a bacatum type. I love bacatums because they have this really distinctive fruity, sometimes almost floral undertone underneath that heat that they have, and it makes for a really interesting eating experience. The problem with traditional bacatums is they are native to South America, and a lot of them don't like cooler soil temperatures, and they're a very, very long season maturity. So sometimes they don't want to mature early enough for me to get peppers here in Ohio. Now, Ají de Colorado solves that problem. It's a landrace variety from Colorado, so it's much more tolerant to cool soils. It's a very early maturity, and the plants stay relatively compact. Some bacatums can just get enormous, and this stayed at kind of a nice, about a 4-foot size. But what I really loved was the flavor. True to bacatums, this one had that nice fruity undertone underneath a pretty good spice level. So I would categorize it somewhere between a jalapeno and a cayenne. Keep in mind though that hot peppers will develop more heat in stressed conditions. So if you have really nice soil, plenty of water, your hot peppers won't tend to be as hot. So this one definitely has the potential to get hotter. It's also a really pretty pepper with a nice color change happening as it reaches different levels of maturity. Now, Wild Mountain Seeds say on their website that this was a favorite of theirs for pico de gallo and also a key ingredient in producing an amazing hot pepper ferment. And I agree, this is one of the best peppers I have ever tried in my fermented hot sauce recipe. Definitely a winner. And next up is winter squash. And I swore I was not going to add any more winter squash to my trial list this year. I already had, I think, 13 varieties when a friend raved to me about Tetsukubota winter squash. I was still going to skip it till I went on the website and saw that it supposedly had squash vine borer resistance, and I had to try it. Now, Tetsukubota is unique in that it is a kabocha butternut cross, and it actually requires pollination from another squash to set fruit. So Johnny's recommends kabocha, butternut, buttercup, or Hubbard squash. This wasn't an issue for me because I was already planning on growing butternut squash, but it could be if you only have room for one squash in your garden. Now, the first thing that I noticed about this variety is the vines are absolutely rampant. It was growing all over my squash patch. It was growing into the lawn. It was growing up into a tree. It was everywhere. But what's nice about these rampant vines is that this squash does what some other squash, like butternuts, will do, and that is it will root kind of wherever those vines touch bare ground. This helps impart some of that squash vine borer resistance because even if a borer gets your main stem, you have plenty of other points where this plant is rooted into the ground. The other thing that helps with the squash vine borers is that this type has a very, very hard stem that it's difficult for them to burrow into. Now, along with those big rampant vines was plenty of production. So this thing, again, produced more squash than my family will probably eat this winter. But it also supposedly has a really long storage life, so we can keep these for a long time. The next thing that I noticed with this was that really dark green, almost black rind color. So really, really unique, easy to spot in the garden, so easy to pick. And that rind is rock hard. And the other remarkable trait was that by the end of the growing season, when most winter squash and pumpkins in my area are just decimated by pests and diseases, these vines still looked relatively healthy. So I got a nice big harvest. And even though I knew better, I just wanted to try one of these so bad, I cut it up pretty quickly after harvest and baked it. This is a type that you should actually cure for at least 6 weeks before eating because it will develop better sugars, better flavor through that curing process and then on into storage. I knew that, but I really wanted to try it. So I baked one up. It was okay. It wasn't great. But then I tried a couple more near Thanksgiving and Christmas, and they were much improved. So tasting/baking notes. What I noticed with this one, very, very dense, relatively dry flesh. So not dry in an unpleasant way, but dry in that a lot of times with pumpkins and winter squash, I actually have to strain them before I use them for something like pie because they have a lot of liquid. This one, I did not have to strain at all before using it in a pumpkin pie. A little bit lower sugar. Now, my friend who grew this last year and this year said last year's batch was sweeter for some reason. Some of that could be weather driven, but I didn't find it to be the sweetest of the squash that I've ever tried, but definitely a really nice, rich flavor. The texture was very, very smooth, so no strings at all. And what's nice about this kind of flavor profile is it lends itself equally well to savory dishes as to sweet. Now, it remains to be seen the storage life on these. I've read really encouraging reports that these will last well into the next spring after harvest. I'm guessing because of that, how hard and dense that rind is, they should store pretty well, but time will tell. If they do store as well as the claims say they will, then this probably will be a regular in my rotation. Definitely impressive in all of its other traits. Next, we have a ground cherry. Now, I find ground cherries of all types to be delightful to grow. There's something about popping those little golden orbs out of the papery husk that is just really fun and satisfying. And honestly, pretty much all of the ground cherry varieties I've grown, which include ones like Aunt Molly's and pineapple, have been really, really nice. Great flavor. This year I grew a variety called Cosex Pineapple. And what I noticed with this one is it was probably the most productive of any ground cherry that I've ever grown. And that's saying a lot because most ground cherries are extremely productive as is. From 2 tiny little seedlings, and I do mean tiny, every year I forget, and I start my ground cherries at the same time as I start my tomatoes and tomatillos. And really, they would be better off being started about a month early. They're really, really slow to get started. But once I got them out into the garden and the heat set in, they really took off to the point where those 2 tiny seedlings almost took over my entire 12-foot raised bed. Like most ground cherries, Cosex Pineapple had a really bright, fruity, almost tropical flavor. And I would definitely say that these lend themselves more to sweet applications. So think jams or preserves, or even I saw a recipe for ground cherry crisp, which I thought sounded good, versus a more savory application like a salsa or a salad, but a really fun, really productive variety. It'll be a sad year, the year that I don't have a tomato favorite from the garden. This year I had one favorite and then a couple of runners up. The favorite is a variety called Raspberry Drops. And this one is the best flavored grape tomato that I have ever grown. Raspberry Drops is part of the Cream of the Crop tomato program, which is a joint effort between AP Whaley Seeds and Frog's Leap Farm. And honestly, the entire Cream of the Crop collection is worth checking out. There are just such amazing, unique, delicious tomatoes in that lineup. Sparky, Tropical Sunset, Red Torch, just a few of my other favorites from that program, but I digress. Raspberry Drops, a beautiful, deep raspberry pink grape tomato. For me, the primary fruit got quite large, so closer to like small plum size. As the season progressed, as is normal, the fruit got a little smaller to where I ended up toward the end of the season with what I would consider a large grape. They're very, very sweet, very meaty, a good little hit of acid there at the end, just an excellent overall flavor and eating quality. They're also very, very good roasted. Now, I first saw this variety in trials in Wisconsin, and even amongst many other fantastically flavored tomatoes, this one stood out. So I've always wanted this in my own garden at home. General plant health, they're big, vigorous, indeterminate vines. So my plants grew to about 8 feet tall. Very, very productive right up until the frost, and good disease resistance, even in my high pressure area of Ohio. I'm also going to mention 3 runners up in the tomato category. Now, I'm mentioning these because they were really, really good and had some really promising attributes. They're just not my favorites of all time. But from the 23 garden, they were top performers. The first is Buffalo Sun tomato, and this is the second year that I've grown Buffalo Sun in my garden. Now, this is a big, meaty, yellow with red splashes, kind of beefsteak style tomato, very reminiscent in appearance to heirlooms like pineapple or striped German. But unlike those heirlooms, Buffalo Sun has vastly improved resistance to cracking, much higher productivity, and better disease resistance. So specifically for my area, it's got resistance to late blight, which is a big deal. So Buffalo Sun had a very sweet, rich flavor, a little lower on the acidity. So for someone who can't tolerate a lot of acid in their tomatoes, it might be a good choice. I like a little more acid, but I still found this one to have a really nice flavor. It also steers very clear of having any kind of a mushy or mealy texture, which for me is an absolute no in a tomato. Now, like I said, this was a favorite in my 2023 garden, but I just have to throw out there, for a big, non-red beefsteak type tomato, still my all-time favorite is a variety called Orange Jazz. So check that one out too. Next up is a variety called Coyote, and Coyote is unique for a couple of different reasons. The first is that it is a different species than your typical standard garden tomato. It's a I can't say the word. I'm just going to put it up here on the screen. It's a currant tomato. So great big, rangy, wild habit, teeny tiny tomatoes. The other is that it grows wild in Mexico and has a lot of what I assume is natural disease resistance. What actually sucked me into growing this one was its claims of late and early blight resistance and septoria leaf spot resistance. And I was not disappointed. This is probably the healthiest tomato plant I've ever grown, even late in the season. So in October, right before that frost, when my tomatoes usually are just kind of crispy and brown, this plant still looked remarkably healthy. Like other currant tomato types, very, very vigorous plants. I probably could have had this one on a 12-foot trellis. It way overgrew the panel I was using. Incredibly productive. One plant, more tomatoes than my family could ever dream of eating. And I mean, it is smaller than a typical cherry tomato, but bigger than some of the other currant varieties I've grown. Coyote had really pretty, creamy, kind of pale yellow fruit. And the fruit is very, very sweet, but this one was not a flavor favorite for me. I tend to like quite acidic tomatoes, and Coyote really had virtually no acid. Again, this could be really good for folks who can't tolerate acidic tomatoes. Very, very sweet. I saw somewhere they described this as having almost vanilla undertones, and I can get that. It was definitely a unique flavor. But even though it wasn't my personal flavor favorite, I feel like I just can't knock it for its other positive attributes. I mean, if you want a healthy, productive, almost no fail tomato for your garden, this is definitely one to look at. And the final runner-up was Perfection in Pink. I am a sucker for indigo tomatoes, or tomatoes that have anthocyanin in them that gives them kind of this deep purpley black blush. Perfection in Pink is kind of a raspberry pink cherry tomato with this really beautiful blue-black splash wherever it's exposed to sunlight. So you get some fruit that are totally shaded that stay entirely pink. I think indigo tomatoes are just gorgeous. And when I was looking back at my camera roll from this past season and realized I had probably 3 times the amount of photos of Perfection in Pink as compared to any other tomato. I think that really attests to my, my attraction to this type. Now, I've grown a lot of indigo type cherries in the past, and really they've all done relatively well. Nothing has ever surpassed my all-time favorite, which is Midnight Snack, but Perfection in Pink was really nice this year. The plants weren't quite as disease resistant as Coyote, but still, at the end of the season, it looked impressively healthy. The fruit have a really nice, balanced, sweet, savory flavor, and it seems very resistant to cracking, which for a cherry tomato is really important because I've had so many where I go out and pick a whole boatload of cherry tomatoes, bring them in, and by the time they're sitting in the kitchen for 2 minutes, they've all split open. And this one doesn't do that. It tends to hold really, really well. And to wrap it up, a few ornamental plants. Now, the first was Ruby Moon Hyacinth Bean, and I've had this on my wish list for years. I have no idea why it took me so long to grow this one. I wish it hadn't, because this plant was gorgeous. The looks alone are enough to earn it a spot in my garden every year. But as a bonus, extremely easy to grow. It just seemed to laugh at our hot, humid summer. The drought later in the season didn't even seem to faze it, and it gave me color all season long. So from the purplish tinted foliage to those gorgeous fuchsia blooms to the decorative purple pods toward the end of the season, just beautiful all around. Now, Hyacinth Bean technically is edible. From what I've read, you have to be really careful with it. You should soak them, and then most sources recommend boiling them twice to get rid of some of the toxic compounds that are in the beans. If you're careful to prep them properly, you can eat them. The flowers and the foliage are both also edible. I, however, did not eat any part of the plants. I was happy to have it out there for the pollinators. The bees and other pollinating insects seem to really enjoy the flowers, and just for me to enjoy the color through the season. And finally, Rouge Royale Sunflower. So I have a ton of volunteer sunflowers every year, but I wanted to kind of shake things up. So in amongst all of the gold sunflowers, I planted some of these Rouge Royale. Now, I first grew this one in trial years ago as a comparison against other dark red colored varieties. And this one looks in real life the way that the old, overly saturated, overly photoshopped pictures of a variety called Velvet Queen used to look in catalogs. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but years ago, Velvet Queen was one of the only dark red varieties. And I feel like every catalog had a picture of it looking like this deep, rich maroon burgundy red color, wine color. And in reality, it actually looks like this. So it had been years since I'd seen this one in person in my own garden, and it did not disappoint. My inner 90s goth teenager was absolutely delighted with these deep, moody, in certain lights, almost black blooms. My only regret this year was not planting these en masse for a really dramatic effect. I will definitely be finding a spot to do that this year. So that wraps up my favorites from the 2023 gardening season. And I'd love to hear from you as well. If you have a favorite or favorites that you grew last year and think I should try in my garden, drop a line in the comments below and let me know. And if you enjoyed today's video, please consider subscribing to my channel, Growfully with Jenna. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.